Greetings all. I've realised I never actually introduced myself in these. I just sort of jump in as if you're all in my lounge room. But my name's Peter Lewis and I'm a director of Essential Media. And I've got my phone ringing, which is awesome as well. And I'm here with my partner in crime, Catherine Murphy from Guardian Australia for our fortnightly political Geekfest. For those that are regulars, you know, jump on the chat, let us know what you're thinking as we go through the polling numbers that our head geek, John Remington, has been putting together up till about 2 minutes ago, but we've got a great little summary of State of the Nation to share with you today. Before we get started, I think respect to traditional owners is always in order. I'm on Gadigal land. I'm back in my roof this week. And I know that you will join me in paying respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognising the land we're all on was never ceded. So let's enter this discussion, I think, Catherine, talking a little bit about why you're sunburnt today and you've suffered for your art over the last 24 hours. But it's been quite a, you know, not just a day, but a few weeks where we've had this grassroots movement that no one was sure what sort of response it would get in terms of numbers on the street around the country yesterday, but it was spectacular in its reach, and not just its scope and size, but I think the feeling. We're up, me and my team were up at the Sydney March. I think John was down in Melbourne and you were in Canberra. I'm sure we've got people from all around Australia, and if you want to let us know where you were yesterday, we'd love to know that too. But you know, it's really hard to make sense of moments immediately after them. But what's your sort of real-time hot take on what we've just gone through?
Yes, and apologies for the sunburn, everybody. I really did cop it. Standing outside for an hour and a half in the full Canberra glare without a hat, which was pretty stupid. But anyway, such is life, suffering for art, as Peter says. Yeah, look, we've addressed it in this group previously, and we'll address it again today. It really has been an incredible month. And by that I mean Parliament's having a Me Too moment, and that's probably long overdue, and it's certainly playing out in quite amazing fashion, really, over the last month or so. In terms of that event yesterday, I think the crowd estimate in Canberra was about 4,000, and certainly standing up where I was, which was not on the stage. If you saw me on the television yesterday, I apologise, that was completely inadvertent. I was perched up on a monument at the top of the Federation Mall trying to get a good sight line on Brittany Higgins entering and exiting that rally, because I needed that sight line for what I was writing. And I discovered later that it looked like I was standing next to her, which horrified me no end. But anyway, such is life. Yeah, look, 4,000, certainly looking down the Federation Mall, I haven't seen a protest that big there for quite some period of time. Pretty amazing atmosphere. Certainly in Canberra, a lot of people had travelled, as well as locals. Lots of women, obviously, lots of male allies, lots of kids, all across the generations. There was a sort of, if you're into feminism, there was a lovely dialogue between the second wave and intersectional feminists at one point. The personal as political met intersectional feminism, which I greatly enjoyed, but anyway, there it was. So yeah, look, it was really, people were really wound up, and I mean that in the best possible way. I think people were really galvanised for change. There were a lot of older women who I spoke to yesterday, including Elizabeth Reid, who was Gough Whitlam's advisor on women's policy, and to my knowledge, the first female member of a parliamentary staff in Australian history. And Elizabeth's in her 70s now, a lovely woman. And she was deeply frustrated that she's still having to go to demos at the age of 78 or whatever she is. So there was a bit of frustration among older women there that seemingly we have to galvanise over and over again for things that really should be basic. But the thing that struck me, Peter, and I don't know how it was in other cities, but that there was hope in the crowd, there was optimism in the crowd, there was resolve in the crowd too, as well as anger. there was, I think, a sort of collective hope that this could genuinely be a change moment. And sort of looping back to what we've been talking about, which is this amazing sort of month or so in politics, and getting in, I'm sure, to an excellent piece you wrote today, drilling into the numbers. I think that's sort of what the Prime Minister's failed to comprehend at every stage of this over the last several weeks. I mean, there's some clues in the numbers, I think, for why Morrison's positioning in the way that he is. But it has been striking to me from my vantage point that the Prime Minister has viewed this as an exercise in political management and damage control, and seems to have missed the fact that there is a genuine societal reckoning going on. And I think it's, I don't understand why this isn't more obvious to the Prime Minister, and all really that was required was more humanity and more empathy. But it's quite interesting around the building. People, you know, I think there is a level of, even though everyone's being very disciplined, I think there is a sort of feeling around the government that they can't quite work out why Morrison's consistently missing the moment here.
So the last the last really big gendered moment in Canberra was, I think, when the pylon on Julia Gillard was occurring. What's different between then and now?
Well, I mentioned in a piece that I wrote about the rally that, funnily enough, when Brittany Higgins ascended the stage yesterday, she was sort of more or less in the same location that Tony Abbott was when he ascended a smaller stage, surrounded by placards that were, you know, Bob Brown's bitch and Julia, and we were at the peak of that period. And obviously there was a very angry and animated crowd on the day that Tony Abbott ascended that stage as well. And this was sort of the flip side of it. And in a funny way, I think there would have been people in that crowd, certainly in Canberra, that I think have been mobilised and radicalised by Julia Gillard's experiences as being the first female Prime Minister. So it was sort of interesting. You know, I said I didn't know if it was sort of quirk of fate or circle of life. I don't know if you've been around long enough, or you know, the stories join up somewhere. But that really struck me. I was down at that Abbott protest, which was sort of at the peak of the carbon wars, and at the rally yesterday as well, with a totally different sort of projection of anger. So, but anyway, look, there are really interesting hooks in the numbers, which I know we'll get to in the conversation about where people are at and how this moment sort of might be playing out.
The last bit I just wanted to get your take on was I don't know if it was a surprise appearance by Brittany Higgins. The idea that this movement is coalescing around a young Liberal staffer is interesting to me. We've done an analysis on female Liberal voters that we'll go through in a little while, which I find fascinating. But how much is that part of this moment that broadens it's out from just being a kind of left-right or a traditional progressive conservative setup?
Yeah, well, that's right. And I think that is, we'll get, I know, because Peter's written an excellent column today. I recommend you track that down on the Guardian.
I will stick it in chat. Thank you. You're too kind. I'm just working out who's seized up, you or me, Catherine?
I know it was me. I think I just dropped out there momentarily. Yes, I'm getting a nice message that my internet connection's unstable. Anyway, cross your fingers, guys. In terms of Brittany Higgins being a Liberal woman fronting this moment, I think is interesting and important, because what it exemplifies is the universal nature of these experiences. And I suspect that's what the Prime Minister is underestimating at the moment. I think sort of bunkered down in the building yesterday, Scott Morrison would have consoled himself with the idea that the people out front with the placards were a progressive crowd. They were hostile to his government. And we heard a lot of that language in the protest yesterday. I don't know how it was in other cities, but there was certainly that language in Canberra. So I think the PM probably imagines to himself that, look, these people who are out in the streets are not people who would vote for me in any case. But I think Brittany Higgins has decided to front this issue, one, because it's important to her. She's had a profound experience and she wants to sort of, as she said yesterday, weaponize it for good. I think that's the point. It's sort of like the sort of morality play of Brittany Higgins' speech yesterday was, if I can be raped allegedly in this building behind us, I'm a woman, I'm an educated woman, I'm politically connected, I was part of the power structure in this country. If it can happen to me, then it can happen to anyone. And the institutional deafness applies across, across the universality of human experience, right? That was the point she was trying to project. I understand that I'm speaking because this is a human moment. This isn't a political moment. Something has happened to me really profoundly in my life, which has put me on a different course. And there are so many women around the country who have experienced something like that, directly or indirectly, through people they know, their own daughters, their sisters, their mothers. A lot of women are acutely aware that experiences like this happen and that they can alter the course of your life. So I think it's, and again, we'll get into identity and where Liberal women are at and all that sort of stuff, and that's a good productive conversation to have. But my own sense of this is that the PM, for whatever reason, doesn't really understand how universal these experiences are for Australian women, either directly or indirectly. And that's been part of the reason why he just can't find his feet here, because he doesn't have that intuitive sense that this is a human experience that many women have encountered. I don't know why I can't wrap his head around it, but that's how it's been manifesting anyway.
Well, it's the gap between sympathy and empathy. And I've spoken to lots of women who I grew up with who it's an opportunity for me to hear their truths as well. There are very few women who were not groped as a rite of passage, and not all blokes grope, but they're all part of the same social milieu. And so this moment is beyond politics. And what's really interesting is that the Prime Minister, who is the consummate politician, doesn't appear to be equipped to handle it. So what he is doing, and I look at this from purely, if you take away the humanity and the waves of social change and just look at it as an issue to be managed, he's kind of found a way that he's got a position he can defend and he's going to hold on to it. So he's actually, I think, arrived at a political point which is in his comfort zone. It's just that there's something washing right over the top of him, and he's banking that will not bear long-term political consequences to him, because that's his rubric, right? It feels a bit like, I don't know, it's not the same, but it feels like when Howard wouldn't march across the Harbour Bridge, right? There was, for reconciliation, there was a huge movement going on and he needed to manage it politically, and he kind of ended up becoming almost irrelevant to that discussion. And maybe that's the real risk that Morrison faces here, not in the next 2 or 3 news polls or essential reports, but in the terms of looking at how we, out of the pandemic, go the next place we want to go as a nation. He's just dealt himself out of that discussion by managing it politically. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I think so. And it's sort of, if we kind of get up in our helicopter even a little higher than that and just look at the Morrison learning story, call it that, right? We saw the Prime Minister fumble the bushfires. Then I saw the Prime Minister learn from the fumbling of the bushfires and and sort of apply some of those lessons during COVID about that sort of big tent, emotionally intelligent, for want of a better term, leading of a country in a crisis. That some of that is consoler in chief, empathizer in chief, cheerleader in chief, all of those sort of skills, which he kind of got a lot better during COVID than he had during the bushfires. Now we sort of see a reversion to this kind of a bushfire manifestation where something really quite big is happening, and he can't find the language to deal with it. He can't find the construction to deal with it. And that's sort of genuinely interesting to me, because I thought he'd learned, and now I wonder how much he learned.
Well, if he didn't learn, then his instincts were particularly good last year, and
Yes.
I don't know, they're being particularly bad again. Let's jump into these numbers, because I think that will kind of reinforce a little bit of what we're talking about here. I will jump on the screen share, and we should all be seeing it now, are we?
Yep.
Embarrassingly, no. Can we?
Yeah, I can.
Good. There we go. So look, we're reversing it. One of the things we don't share with you most weeks, because it doesn't actually tell us that much, is we ask people, we put out 4 news stories and say, how aware are you of these stories? But John thought it was worth dropping in this week, because you can just see the level of awareness of these issues since the Four Corners story broke last year, when it was one of the 4 we put in the list. It's normally around coronavirus, something international, and another local story. And I think when this first aired back in November, it was kind of, bronze medal or out of the medal places in terms of our 4 news stories. But it's definitely up there now, and it's the level of engagement is stronger amongst women, although not all women, but it's on the radar.
Yeah, well, this has been certainly my experience, is that the sort of women, like, just putting a gender lens on this briefly, for both of the major parties, women over the age of 35 are the kind of unicorns of the whole caper, because there's a big swinging cohort among those voters. And those women are hard to reach, because they're busy, they've got a bunch of other responsibilities, they don't always tune into politics. But what I've been acutely conscious of over the last month or so is that women who wouldn't normally be listening, and listening closely, are listening, that this story has registered and cut through. And not only women, but I'm just making the point about an important demographic and how they're consuming this story. So it's got a, people have got busy lives. They don't always follow what's happening in Canberra, but my very strong sense is that they are following these stories, and obviously these numbers bear that out.
We asked some specific questions about the sexual assault. I don't even know how to group this in a both a respectful and accurate way, but what's interesting in these findings, and these are the national, I'll give you some breakdowns in a sec, under 10%, except this is just a Canberra insider story. It's more than that. Those high numbers, it's time women will believe when they say they've been assaulted, and what is happening in Canberra is relevant to all women, is strongly supported across the spectrum, but obviously more with women than men. The other one, which we threw in there because we wanted to put in counter arguments as well and just see where they land. Because the charge of rape is so serious, the burden of proof needs to be high. People accept that as well. So I think, in a way, the idea of a criminal prosecution of Port has become a bit of a straw man, and that rule of law and police investigation, but it misses the bigger picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it's sort of what these numbers demonstrate is that people have sort of grasped the complexity of what they're looking at. That humans are capable of having 2 views that might appear mutually exclusive at the same time. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. Like, what these numbers say is we're at a tipping point in the culture where just kind of copying it sweet on this stuff is over. That's done. So we're moving into a phase where everybody acknowledges the universality of this experience and are inclined to believe victims. Whereas that was not always the case. There was a woman who participated in Canberra just briefly yesterday who, it wasn't Elizabeth Reed, it was another woman in her 70s, and sadly I've forgotten her name just in this moment. But she actually, she wept at some point during her contribution on stage, because she said it was so profound and important to her that when the Me Too stuff happened in America, when accusations were leveled against powerful men in Hollywood, and the complainants were believed, that in the culture it was accepted that these women were telling the truth. That was such an important moment for her, because up until that point, her lived experience had been that women were not believed in a cultural sense. So we're hitting a point in time, and I don't really know why, but we're hitting a point in the culture where victims are respected and believed, but also we are also at a point where people understand, obviously, that this is not a frivolous issue, that rape is a serious charge, burden of proof needs to be beyond reasonable doubt. You know, you can't just sort of, to borrow the Prime Minister's kind of slightly weaponized phrasing, you just can't be a lynch mob about it. There's got to be some sort of procedural fairness as well.
I want to break those numbers down in terms of coalition voters and gender, because I find this fascinating. So can I just set up my latest theory, and for you to shoot down if you like. But I think there's a mythical creature in Australian politics, which is the female Liberal voter who might change her vote on a matter of principle. And we've seen her and I was almost, and I had some very wise women that counselled me to get rid of what was quite a clumsy metaphor of the sirens on the rocks calling progressives in. So I didn't go there in the piece, and I'm glad I didn't. But we had the doctors' wives who were concerned about children in detention and were going to change their votes, but they didn't. We had blue-green women who were going to care about climate change until they didn't. We had the sense that the Morris, like that when Turnbull got rolled and the Julies and Julias were leaving the parliament, there was nothing to see here for women anymore, but they maintained their vote. And so these women that still vote Liberal, I think, are fascinating. And what's interesting over these few slides is both, I think, their expression as women voters and also their expressions as Liberal voters. So let's look at them as women voters first. And obviously, compared to coalition men, they're significantly more likely to agree with those propositions we put forward. Now, 29-13 in saying, so 29% of coalition males do accept that it's just a Canberra insider story, 13% women. 74%, which I think matches or 68 was all voters. So coalition female voters are more likely than average Australians to accept those other two propositions, but they're also more likely than both coalition males and other voters to accept the proposition that rape is a really serious charge and there needs to be a high burden of proof. So I found that interesting. I'll just go through these three slides and then we can maybe sort of kick them around. The second one was the attitude to Morrison's position on an independent inquiry. All voters, what have we got? 30% agree with Morrison. That's 36 disagree, 34 no view. So that's kind of one of those issues that is totally line ball. When you've got 30, 30, 30, you say that it's undecided. Amongst coalition voters, it's much stronger, 50% agree. But I think there, John, even female voters were stronger on that one, female coalition voters. Now I'm going to send him into panic.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yes, that is correct. So the independent inquiry, yes, memory, I haven't got the exact figures.
You can put the answers in the chat as we go. I thought that was one that we had there, but I apologize for putting you on the spot. And finally, so there's the independent inquiry, 55, 45 all up. So that he's not losing that debate. He's not losing that debate hands down, right?
No, exactly.
And that's what all the energy of yesterday makes you think, that the government's being smashed. They are still holding their line politically.
It's but it's sort of what I appreciate about these numbers is that it gives us more of a sense that of the calculation in Morrison's position. I'm very conscious of him just failing to rise to a cultural moment, but these numbers give us a sense of what is informing some of the calculations that the Prime Minister is making. And again, it's sort of been interesting in recent, if we sort of look at the trajectory of Scott Morrison, Prime Minister, we've seen him as a weaponizer. In more recent times, we've seen him sort of revert to a more big tent kind of approach to politics, where he's tried not to get excessively tangled up in cultural debates. Now he's sort of, I would say in relation to this stuff, he's mildly weaponizing rather than overtly weaponizing.
I was interested, speaking of weapons, what do you think the thought process was that led to that statement in Parliament, that how good is Australia that you can protest without being shot?
Oh, I'm sorry to laugh because it's really not funny. Well, look, judgment sort of like setting aside the fact that both of us are acknowledging in this conversation that these numbers demonstrate that there is a purpose in Morrison's positioning. It's not just kind of like, the guy's lost the plot. There is a purpose in his positioning. But with due acknowledgement to that, moving on to your question, which is yesterday, how about the bullets? Like what? It was sort of judgment deserted Morrison yesterday in a couple of significant ways. The first was he decided to, address the march, the reality of the march outside the building with a statement on indulgence at the opening of question time. Now, the thing about statements on indulgence is they're not timed. So he stood up, he made a statement on indulgence. He gave the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, who had been down at the march, an opening then to get up on his feet and talk for an unlimited period of time about the march and its implications, which set up then their whole question time attack, where Morrison got question after question about the deficiency in the response, right? So that was the first tactical misjudgment. In terms of the bullets thing, I honestly, I don't know what was in his head. I mean, look, obviously the situation in Myanmar, and that's what I presume he was referring to, is, a deeply troubling and worrying scenario. Australia's been taking interest in it. Perhaps he got a briefing in the morning about...
Yeah, that's what you feel, isn't it?
In Myanmar, and it was in his mind, and justly so. I mean, obviously, things are very serious, and thank God for democracy, right? Like, who can object to that? But the thing went like, it just fell like a hammer in the place. It was just the framing of that was so poor in the light of all the other misjudgments or missteps over the last month or so. And I thought pretty much every member of the government became profoundly interested in their smartphone round about that moment.
Do you perceive him losing? Well, he hasn't got many female MPs, does he? But is there any sense that there is anything going on there that there's...
Well, people have been very disciplined, obviously, and looping back to the numbers here, these numbers give you a sense of the calculations and why why the government has framed this issue in the way that it has, and some sort of philosophical, we're Liberals, we don't go to protests, we're Liberals, rule of law matters. All this sort of stuff. I mean, that's more than just talking points. These are philosophical tenets of this particular political movement. And I think women are being very disciplined in what they're saying in relation to this. But I think it was pretty obvious in the body language yesterday that everybody feels trapped in this set of responses that that just don't feel intuitively right, that just don't line up entirely with the cultural moment the country's in. So I do think there is concern in the government that that Morrison's just not hitting this in the way that he needs to, in just an empathetic and a human way. I genuinely think there are concerns around the government about that. Whether or not anybody will actually take him on, of course, is another matter entirely.
Yeah, and Julie and Scott are looking at these figures. That's Scott from our group, not the Scott. Not believing that, in terms of approval, it's been a 3-point drop, but only 3 points. We'll show you a little bit about Liberal voters in the next slide, but currently there, that news poll this week, 52-48, is kind of similar to where we would be if we were running the horse race, which is around the 50s and 1 or 2 points either way. I think you could read too much into that shift and not enough into this. And I guess in terms of whether yesterday was a moment or a movement, the real challenge is what do you do with those numbers to actually force a change in position? And this is the really interesting one that John put together. Look at female coalition voters, 90% approval for Morrison through all this. And that's where I say we look at female Liberal voters and we often focus on the female part of them, but they're also Liberal voters, and Liberal voters have a view of government, which, as you just said, they don't do big protests. Government does not engineer the future. They drive the economy, although obviously that project itself has often been linked to deregulation and privatizations, and it's not devoid of radical change. But the perception that things are pretty good, regardless, this is an issue that's outside politics. Government's got us through the pandemic, just keep walking on. It's a real challenge for those that want to take out of this moment more than those fantastic rallies yesterday.
No, that's right. And you've got to bear in mind how important people's partisan identities are. It's kind of like societies are increasingly secularized. It's sort of like politics has become the new religion in a way. It's sort of people's partisan identities are very important to them, at least people who are partisan, people who are rusted on. These identities are important. So again, it's like all of these numbers sort of show us that there is a genuine battle of ideas playing out here, and through some you feel differently about things. Like again, the big picture, like you do feel differently about things based on your gender and on your partisan identity. But I think some of the percentages here indicate that there's a genuine contest in that battle of ideas. It's just how I don't know how that will play out, but anyway, it's just really interesting. Sorry, I'm not being very articulate. But
no, you're incredibly articulate as always. John, putting you on the spot again, there's a few questions on age. I'm particularly interested in where younger males are in all this. Is there anything that points to there being any difference between older blokes and younger blokes?
Not necessarily with blokes. We do see an age difference overall, in that old people generally are more see this as more of an issue, more of a concern for them.
It's more of an issue and more of a concern than younger people.
Yeah. So whether or not that's splits out within the genders, we'd have to look a little bit more into. And similarly, if we were looking at within just coalition voters.
Wasn't expecting that answer. All right. Let's talk about, I guess, the performance of and opportunities for Labor through this. Being opposition is never where you want to be, but it does provide, I would have thought, huge opportunities for Labor to seize the moment, given that the other side seems to be waving it through.
Yeah, well, it is complicated to some degree by Morrison's sort of part of his positioning with all of this has been holding Labor's feet to the fire about its own record in the building.
What aboutism?
whataboutism. Yes, because like there's two reasons Morrison does that. One is that if it's a all politics problem, then it's less of a government problem. And also because there's an element of truth that nobody has covered themselves in glory here. But certainly, and yesterday was an interesting case study. If you sort of watch everything for a living as I do, Anthony Albanese sort of started the day with a press conference surrounded by women and babies where he got hammered. Basically, he sort of wanted to frame the march, or his appearance at the march, or his participation in the march, I should say, with an image of, I get it, right? I'm surrounded by working women with kids, but he absolutely got smashed at a press conference about Labor's own record in relation to these matters. He went down to the march. I watched him circulating in the crowd. It was quite interesting, actually, just the body language of it. He was obviously listening very intently, engaging with people, quite comfortable being there, and then came back into the building. And when Scott Morrison opened the door, provided that tactical opportunity to speak on indulgence, Albanese didn't miss. He absolutely nailed it in terms of reporting back to Parliament the feeling, the sort of, the atmosphere and the importance of that march, and sort of creating an air gap between that feeling and the Prime Minister, who was literally not present and literally not listening. So yeah, look, there's certainly opportunity, but there's also there's also this reckoning that's happening in the Parliament about what's happened in the past, whether it's been good enough or not, and how that plays out into the future. So there's an element of complexity for both of the major parties, but in terms of there's more, I suppose, pulling out from that, right? Just call it instances of bad behaviour on the Labor side. Anthony Albanese is much more comfortable with a cultural moment, if I can express it in those terms. This is much more natural territory for a progressive leader. And watching him circulate in that march yesterday was really quite interesting, because he is...
he's a movement guy. That's where he came.
He's really comfortable out there, and people conversing with him quite freely, and that was interesting as well. Just to because it's interesting always to see politicians sort of out and about in situations. How do they conduct themselves? And that was.
Do you think Labor suffers from having an all-male leadership? Leader and deputy at the moment,
it's kind of men down the bottom, ladies up the top in terms of Senate. There's Penny Wong and Christina Keneally in the Senate, and the two blokes down the bottom. The other person, a number of the whole leadership team were down there yesterday, Albanese and Miles, and also Penny Wong, Christina Keneally, and importantly Tanya Plibersek, who holds that portfolio and is obviously a very important empathetic figure for Labor voters. So they were all down there, and a number of others besides. Look, I don't know, there are schools of thought, obviously, about when Labor people think that Anthony Albanese can't get them there, that he's just not kind of rising, that he's not, when they have moments of doubt, certainly some of them think about, well, is Tanya Plibersek a better foil, right, against Morrison? Would she sort of set out the differentiation point more sharply and more plainly? So, I mean, that's a conversation that they play in their own heads, I think. But I don't necessarily know that it's an automatic plus to just have leadership of a different gender prosecuting these arguments. I think, funnily enough, what women, I mean, God, sorry to appoint myself spokeswoman for women, which is just ridiculous. But I think what women are looking for from this moment is this sense that blokes are prepared to school themselves, that blokes are prepared to learn, that blokes are prepared to project a different set of norms. I think that's actually quite important and a bit underrated in all of this.
Yeah, in a way, gender shouldn't be a women's issue.
Well, it's sort of, it is. It sort of unavoidably is.
But if that's all it is, it's just another issue rather than being at the core of the way that we organise our society.
Exactly. It's sort of like what the frustration, part of the collective frustration level that's existing here across voting demographics, generations and life experiences is why are women always responsible for leading these arguments? Why do women have to articulate how things need to change? Why don't blokes adjust their own plumb line? That's quite deep frustration. So I actually think if you're a bloke who can demonstrate a bit of emotional intelligence, can demonstrate a bit of listening, that can actually carry you quite a long way in the current climate, because that is really a signal that many women are looking for.
I think my other question that is to you, but also I think to the universe at the moment, is this issue confined to the very important issues of creating a safe place of work in the parliament or sexual violence more broadly, or is it about reimagining, a broader economic model that sees women more clearly? So
yeah,
my mind goes to superannuation reform, where if you are off having kids, you don't get any super, which puts you at a material disadvantage. Or I think of the early learning policies that Labor's starting to develop. I think about the dysfunction in aged care, which I think, and it's not a ripe situation, but women tend to be more caring for their older relatives than men. And that's not a good thing, but it's a reality. So is there a moment here that you, and I don't want to sound that this is a cynical opportunity, but is there a moment to leverage broader economic policies off this horrible situation that Canberra is confronting?
Well, it's I think, again, sort of playing back to that point about how I think a lot of women would like men to accept some responsibility for this, to adjust their own thinking, recalibrate their own thinking. I think there are some opportunities, because we've sort of got the tropes in this argument, and this is where things have been a bit fraught for Morrison. I think that Morrison's sort of viewing these issues through a protection frame. Women have to be protected. I think what a lot of women, and again, doesn't really matter who you vote for, it's not so much that women want to be protected as if we're in a 19th century novel. We actually just want society to be more equal. And protection flows from equality. That's the point. If there is a sort of, if we're all on the same playing field, then some of these sort of issues fall away, because the foundation stone of it is more equality. Now, then you get into sort of progressive, you get into culture war territory. It's a bit fraught, because again, it gets to the sort of resting political sensibilities of women and men who support women. It's sort of like, I would express that through a progressive lens, but a liberal woman might express that slightly differently. You get into do you actively level the playing field so everything's equal, or is it equality of opportunity, meaning that everybody, which is sort of the frame that the Liberals like. So it's sort of difficult because it can sort of take you back into some old traps and tropes, but I think there is some territory there around which concepts can be prosecuted. I think certainly women are sick of the inequality that is structural in our society, and sick of it from, on a hierarchy of needs, starting with sexual violence and working right back through all the other inequalities in society. I think it's sort of interesting too, on your point, Peter, about, what platforms can you build here. I think COVID's kind of interesting too, in a way, because if we think about women's experience in COVID, women were the first, sort of cohort to lose their jobs in the downturn, first cohort to recover, and by that I'm meaning hospitality and caring and other people who were really hit hard. Those jobs have come back, but not to the same level as pre-pandemic. But the other thing that's also happening that's a bit more of a silent story, I think, out there is that a number of professional women have radically adjusted their working lives in order to balance caring responsibilities through lockdowns. And that's a bit of a sleeper out there, I think, that there's sort of been this default back to having to deal with the sort of prospect of sudden sharp changes in lifestyle. So again, sort of getting back to that equality point, I think there's some profit to be had there in a conversation, but it's kind of lifting it out of, it's lifting it out of the old sort of culture war dynamic that makes then people kind of just flee back to their partisan identities and express things in progressive terms or express things in liberal or conservative terms. I don't know what the new bloody language is, but I wish we could find it.
Well, I'm really interested in this concept of care because I think it, and I try to pull this, I will put this piece, I try to pull it together in this piece, but if there's a common understanding of what's going on at the moment, it's about caring for what happens to women. I think there's an opportunity to position Morrison as someone who actually doesn't care. And in a way, politics is actually the art often of not caring and letting things go through. And I think it could be a really interesting positioning, but also a great counterpoint for the Labor project or the Progressive project, which is to actually drive change because you care about the sort of society that comes out the other end. I don't know. A lot of my thinking has been, how do we build a bridge towards those female Liberal voters who might change their vote but never do? And I do feel we need to speak to them not as just as women, but as also people that the system isn't always delivering for.
Well, it's sort of, and again, it's sort of like, I guess it loops back to a theme that we've been chewing over really for the last 12 months. I know you're thinking very deeply about that, but in an electoral sense, I guess part of whether that can be activated or not is a function of where people are at in their minds. And I think that it's sort of harder to mount those arguments in a crisis environment. If people still, what I'm trying to say is the pandemic crowds out other imperatives. People may be very concerned about climate change or about gender inequality or a whole bunch of quite important things. But if they're sort of basically, if their thinking then reduces at the ballot box to, am I going to have a job tomorrow and am I going to die of COVID? Well, then the choice narrows, I guess, right? So it sort of depends. The answer to your question, again, not my most articulate day, forgive me, everybody, but it's sort of like, again, it depends what playing field you're on. But at the time of the election, I think is the honest answer. If people are sort of thinking about the future and building, all this phraseology that, build back better and all that sort of stuff that kind of trickles around. If people are in a future, if they're future minded, well, the territory opens up. If they're very present focused, then less so. Indeed.
I just threw up another slide, and we probably won't get through them today, but I was actually expecting a drop back in trust in institutions, Catherine. So over the last year, we've seen trust in institutions grow through our response to the pandemic. 1 point down for federal parliament, despite the last 2 weeks, struck me as interesting.
Snap, yeah.
So what does that tell us? I think that, in fact, the moment for real systemic change is we're still in that sweet spot, that people are looking at government, and even, dare I say it, female Liberal voters who might one day change their vote are seeing government having delivered over the last 12 months. That has to be an opportunity.
Well, of course it does. And that's why it's so important, and partly why I get so frustrated at the moment is that this crisis has visited all kinds of stress and difficulty for us as, us as a people. But it has also created this opportunity where politicians across all parties, certainly over the last 12 months, have demonstrated the functionality of government in this country, the functionality of the federation and the functionality of government. This is such an important thing that's happened, like so profoundly important, because so much flows from it. And I really, sort of seeing the whole system dabble with a sort of short, sharp return to the worst case scenario is just profoundly irritating to me, because it's sort of like this is such a hard won recovery in an institutional sense. And it's the difference between things being able to happen or not. It's the difference between Australia having a functional democracy and America, which in the Trump period fell into a dysfunctional democracy where everything was contested and there was no shared reality. It's sort of like, I'm sorry to sort of, preach on this, but it's so important. It is so important because everything else follows from this. So, it's like a constant refrain of mine. If these people could really not be dickheads and trash this trust, I would be very, very grateful as a citizen.
Because we can have marches without being shot at, Catherine.
Well, that's right. I'd prefer to avoid the bullets if at all possible.
Yeah. Last one. Through all this, the Aged Care Royal Commission really got swamped, despite the best efforts of ABC's Anne Connolly to hold the Prime Minister to account in what was some compelling, it was actually a compelling piece of vision that links both the gender issues and aged care, I thought. But there is on these numbers, no real appetite for the sort of systemic change the Royal Commission's advocating, which is sobering, but also maybe a function of not giving those findings due attention.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, look, I'm paid to watch this stuff for a living and be across all of it, and I still have not found the bandwidth to get through all of the volumes of the aged care response. Now, I'm not suggesting that voters around the country are going to read every volume of the Aged Care Royal Commission response. Obviously, it would be a unique cohort of people who do that. But like, I'm plugged into this at every level, and I'm not across all the permutations of this argument because it has been so comprehensively crowded out. So what hope do people getting about their normal lives have of being able to focus on these recommendations? They have been so comprehensively crowded out over the last month or so, which is a great shame. I mean, we will return to this issue, obviously, or at least I hope we will. But it's been tough for any other issue apart from this culture.
And that's the other cost of this moment, isn't it? And the system failure, which you've got to call this a system failure of the Parliament to provide a safe place for women. But the implication of that is not just broken lives, it's actually a logjam on the attention that is needed to deal with life and death issues in other parts of society.
No, exactly. It's like there's a tangible opportunity cost here. And it's sort of like, wearing my reporter's hat, it's like over the last month, it's sort of, I've thought several times, oh my God, like there are some really important policy debates that are flashing past me at warp speed that I haven't been able to get anywhere near prosecuting because this other stuff is important. And I've felt a very profound sense of responsibility to report this story diligently and accurately. But there's an opportunity cost to
So what is waiting to come out of the wings in the unlikely situation that this ship rights itself in the next few weeks, Catherine?
In what sense? In what sense, Pete?
Well, what are the issues that are being held back, the work of the Parliament that's being held back through the stubborn refusal to hold an inquiry to at least put a marker on this issue to contain it?
Yeah, well, aged care is the sort of obvious case in point, although I suspect that work on that is grinding away ahead of the budget. I suspect the machinery of government is weighing in there. You know,
because the other thing is things that come in under the radar. Of course, we're working with the disability sectors. There's some real nasties they're trying to slip through under the cloak at the moment as well.
Yeah, well, there's and I'm aware of, so this is assessments and other things. I'm aware of that debate, which is happening. Obviously, the withdrawal of income support has been playing out over the last little bit. Again, that has to sort of, the impact of that has to flow through the economy, and we see where we land after that. I mean, look, in fairness, I do think again, the machinery of government is kind of moving on, even though there's not a massive amount of attention being placed on some of these issues. But yeah, you know, in the lead up to the budget, I guess the government's got some opportunity to define some territory here, and you know, and that'll be interesting and important.
Penelope was just saying, do we think that sort of finding new ways of managing around these sorts of events is one way of keeping people engaged and feet to the fire? Absolutely. I think what's great about spending an hour talking around these issues is we go deeper. I think you and I get to think through some of the things that are before us, and hopefully helps inform some of your fantastic reporting, and also obviously helps John and I work out where we go next with our polling. But it's all done in a dynamic way with the chatterati, as one of our participants was calling it, offering real input as we go. We're at the hour. I'd like to thank you, Catherine, for your time. I know people don't realise how smashed you are right through a parliamentary sitting week, but the fact that you come down into the soundproof booth and give us an hour of your time is really something. And thanks, John, for pulling all the slides together with Dana from Essential. And keep coming back, because we'll keep doing this as long as you're here, guys. So thanks a lot for being part of it today. And hopefully we will have some movement and some other issues to be building out in the next fortnight, but not at the not at the expense of these important issues that need to really be landed.
Yep. Thank you.
That's about it.
Yep, think so.
See you guys.
Better run for questions.
Take care.
See ya.
Enjoy.